Welcome to a news update from the Paddle and Portage Podcast. I'm M. Baxley, and I'm sitting here with Joe Fredericks.
Hey, LB.
Joe, today we're tackling two issues on the news update. One is from last week that has potential impacts on federal land, and the second is the localized paddle industry impacts of tariffs. Let's start with the first. This came in the form of an email, actually a text message you sent to me this morning with a map of northern Minnesota that had lots and lots of color over the Boundary Waters Superior National Forest. And along with that map was this order talking about expedited timber sales. So we immediately started responding to this new information. Tell us about it.
Well, I was very caffeinated when I sent that to you this morning.
I was very caffeinated when I received it.
And so as we're looking at the map, though, in our defense of the caffeination reference, because that is alluding to the fact we were pretty excited about seeing this map, which showed that timber production and designating this emergency situation on national forest lands that was signed April 3rd by USDA, United States Department of Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins, that it had the BWCA, like the wilderness area, is highlighted on the map.
In its entirety.
Yes, all of Superior National Forest, including the BWCA, the wilderness, inside the wilderness. So looking at that, his reaction is, what the heck? Timber extraction, resourcing, timber production, as the agency refers to it, logging, as it's more commonly referred to, or even prescribed fire, inside the BWCA. Whoa, what's going on?
Yeah, let's explain the order.
The easiest way to think of it is that what was signed April 3rd is declaring an emergency on some national forest lands, and that in order to deal with this emergency, there's going to be what's being used and in order to deal with this emergency, the federal government's going to use the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and that order calls for widespread logging on land to boost timber production and reduce wildfire risk.
Right, and some context to that is the emergency that is being discussed is a shortage as a result of tariffs that are decreasing the ability for timber to come across from the Canadian border primarily, but also from other countries into the United States. So we have this tariff, I'll say crisis, for lack of a better word, of resources. So then an executive order claiming that emergency and then the need to essentially use your word, log federal lands rapidly.
Right. And also there's the threat of wildfire. So there's deadfall and spruce budworm, like forests that are standing dead and are high risk for fire. So invasive pests and these kind of things all get lumped into that too. So it's not just like the need for logging and that we need more timber. It's also like we got a lot of serious threat out there for wildfire. That part makes sense because that's true.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
There is a lot of potential high risk for wildfire, and including places like the Boundary Waters.
And Superior National Forest.
Absolutely. So that part of it. But it was just the fact the alarm bells went off when we saw that map and it was inside the BWCA. We have since learned that federally designated wildernesses, including what other places on the map, the Frank Church, that river of no return out in Idaho, beautiful part of the state, that's a wilderness area. That's also highlighted on this map. And the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, incredible place. And that was also highlighted. The federal government, the Forest Service, confirmed with Bloomberg News, like Bloomberg Law Review, actually. These are the people that are getting into this story that we're very fascinated by. They talked to them on Monday, and the Forest Service said, wilderness areas will not be included in this.
Yeah, it's based on the idea that to the extent that there is any inconsistency between the provisions of the memo and any federal laws or regulations, the laws or regulations will control. So the 1978 BWCAW Act would take precedence over the general emergency authorities granted in the emergency order.
Right, exactly. And so that cooled it down for a bit. Now we're into like maybe 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the morning on the 8th of April as we're first learning this and doing some reporting about this and asking questions of the Forest Service. Reached out to Tom Hall and their spokespeople in the Duluth office for comment on this. And there's a process right now that goes through Milwaukee and even Washington for a story like this. So we haven't heard back from the Forest Service yet. And then we also reached out to Wilderness Watch, an environmental organization that does a lot of things with wilderness law, wilderness character. It's involved in legal situations with even the Forest Service. We heard back from them, Kevin Preschold, and he was one who said, yeah, it looks like the wilderness will be protected. We've since confirmed that with Kevin and other people, including the Forest Service's statement to Bloomberg News. And the issue, though, remains, this is a big deal for Superior National Forest.
Exactly. So at this point, we have to sort of trust that that will hold and that the precedents will be maintained. That's sort of the whole point of those acts.
Wilderness Act. So, yeah, that the precedent for the wilderness will remain the same, that the wilderness is safe, but don't overlook what this means for Superior National Forest. That's what Kevin's saying. And we also spoke with Dave and Pete from Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness, echoed the same thing. Wilderness, going to be okay for now, but Superior National Forest, don't forget about what this means outside. And when we say that, that's the Gunflint Corridor,
the Echo Corridor, the Fernberg, Sawbill. I mean, I think most people understand this, but not everybody's familiar that the federal land that is adjacent to and surrounding the wilderness, that is Superior National Forest. That is already managed as a resource by the federal government, and therefore this executive order is opening the door to expedite timber management in a variety of forms on those lands. So that could have some very broad impacts on our wilderness edge communities as people who live here and on visitation to our wilderness edge communities, aka all of you listening who come up here to enjoy the beauty that's even outside of the wilderness, all the campgrounds, all the trail systems, all the motorized use and access. So this is, still broadly impacts recreation.
Well, and as Kevin described it to us, and I'll quote from the response, says, quote, "The Secretary's order is terrible for our national forests. It's an attempt to ramp up logging and to weaken the environmental protections for the national forest to do so, at least in part to make up for the expected loss of timber products from Canada due to Trump's tariff war," unquote. And I left a word out of there, not profanity, but an opinion from Wilderness Watch, certainly, about the tariff war in particular. So, that's the situation we're going into. The Friends, Pete and Dave, they echoed largely what Kevin said about, hey, great for the wilderness, we should be fine, the Wilderness Act's going to protect it, but this is serious for Superior National Forest. The fact we're in the bullseye of this order that came from the USDA, what does that mean for us? We need to start thinking about that.
Yeah. It's it seems fairly accurate to say that the broad takeaway is that don't maybe even look at the map that came out and with this information and pay attention to the facts, which is right now, Wilderness Act takes precedent over executive order. Not so on Superior National Forest land here. What we are wondering what that means for us in regards to recreation, use, resource management, to be determined. Does
Correct.
that seem like that sort of summarizes it all?
It does.
A bit.
It summarizes it in the sense of there was great concern from some people in the paddling community about what this meant for the BWCA specifically. In other words, if they start allowing logging inside the wilderness, what does that mean for mining, extraction? Does that open the floodgates? So that's where oh my goodness, the BWCA is on this map. Good to walk that back a little bit, get some perspective and some facts, and that's what reporting is, right? If we just ran the story before we actually did the homework, That's not journalism. That's blogging at best or social media posts. And
Sure. Think the intersection between this, its sort of relationship to tariffs, brings us into this next, like all of this is happening with the backdrop of the tariff policy changes. And what we are also seeing impacts from that on our paddling community, especially the economics of our paddling community. Here at Paddle and Portage, as a paddling storytelling outlet, we work with storytellers and potential sponsors on the Canadian side of the border. They are our friends and they are our colleagues. And we have been hearing from them that this tariff situation has impacted business. We talked about that at Canoecopia, and that was a direct impact. Now we're kind of having to revisit that all as it plays out in real time. At the very least, we know, even here at Paddle and Portage, that we're having to negotiate our arrangements with those other colleagues and businesses as a result of tariffs. How far do you want to go into that?
well, what we heard from a individual who works for a large paddle sports company based in Canada told us on April 8th, this was shared to us, that, quote, some are looking at 68% tariffs and if Trump follows through, up to 100% on certain parts or components. Our industry can't bear those costs without significant price increases, unquote. So there's that part of it. That's the straight economic component of it, as you're referencing.
I think the more extensive possibility, as expressed to us by this colleague, is, quote, Trump's most recent tariff volley has left us shell-shocked and represents a potential crash for the paddle sport industry, American and non-American companies alike, unquote.
Right, so that's painting a different type of scenario where it's like people are just stopped in their track. The paddle sports industry, when we think about canoes coming across the border, gear that's used in places like the Boundary Waters, that's being impacted right now by these tariffs, like right now. I spoke with an outfitter up the Gunflint Trail recently within the past 2 weeks, and they said that a canoe manufacturer insisted to meet him in Grand Marais. You got to come down, meet me in Grand Marais. I got to get these canoes brought across the border and delivered to you before these tariffs ramp up and get more intense. So that was like right on the cusp of all that. It was just, before this, we're now in full swing of this. So it's like, this isn't just like something happening with the auto industry or other parts that really dominate the national headlines when we're talking about the tariffs and things. This really gets down into canoes.
Exactly. And canoes, the parts and pieces used to build, materials that are used to construct the tools that we recreate with and the toys we recreate with, is all in a dramatic shift. And that shift is still playing out. We're hearing that some people are afraid of the impacts of that shift. We'll see how it all plays out. And I think our goal, Joe Fredericks, is to get the information to you, our listeners, as we get it, so we can all make sense of what the future can look like.
Exactly, and that's why it's really important that we're following the example that was set by Bloomberg News and their reporters in Washington, D.C., when we're saying, yes, the BWCA, the Gila, Frank Church, River of No Return, those are on this map, but they're not part of this order signed by the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture.
I think here at Paddle and Portage, we try to navigate this very human space of reporting that news through that journalistic lens and simultaneously sharing the real human stories of people impacted by that news. So our goal of bringing both the human experience with the factual reporting of policy as best as we can in real time is what I hope people can continue to expect from us, and we will do our best to deliver that as this unfolds.
Absolutely. And to illustrate that, I mean, in real time, as we're talking about economic hardships and so forth, like today we've also posted a story on the website about a family from here near Grand Marais that took a trip on spring break from school, 2 kids that are in school here at Cook County, and went paddling on a river in Arkansas, the Buffalo River. These stories are still happening. They have nothing to do with all this. And we're still getting out paddling and able to share those stories because they're going to keep happening. When the water opens in the Boundary Waters next month in May, people are going to come paddling here, and we're going to share those stories. And it's sometimes those stories intersect with the news that we're doing on the podcast, and sometimes they don't.
Well, thank you, Joe, for bringing your journalistic experience and your storytelling to all of us. Until next time, this is Em Baxley.
Joe Fredericks.